The licence scheme may be managed by people that have never done a burn ever and don't understand the process of burning, the nuances of burning and the skill involved in burning. And there's a huge misconception that burning across the surface in some way has an impact on the peat layers below the surface. But Muirburn done well prevents damage to the peat rather than causes damage to the peat. The licensing scheme may be overly restrictive, and we've heard this morning a couple of cases where licences have been applied for but not granted. And what we don't want to see is a system that's so complicated and so restrictive and so tightly managed that it almost becomes impossible for Muirburn to take place. As I say, I've got great sympathy for the licensing agency because there's a lot of unknowns in there. Peat depth. This gives me some real concern, if I'm honest. Removing that 10 centimetre differentiation between 50 centimetres and 40 centimetres means that the acreage that can be burnt is going to be reduced, which means that the areas that are currently managed by Muirburn won't be managed by Muirburn, and as was mentioned earlier on, cutting is an option, definitely. However, in my view, cutting actually increases the risk of fire in the long term. In the short term, while the cut material is still wet, it's excellent at preventing fire from travelling through it. But once that becomes part of the litter layer, it's often where the fire starts, and it's definitely where the fire spreads. So unless that cut material is completely removed, we're actually creating a deeper layer of litter that will allow the fire to propagate. The analogy I use regularly is it's the same as going into a house fire of a minimalist versus a house fire of a hoarder. The fuel load is far greater, the fire is far more challenging in one than the other. It's also a below ground measure for an above ground activity, and Muirburn done well. We hear the phrase cold fires. It's done quickly, it's done effectively, it's lit and it's extinguished within minutes. And the heat doesn't penetrate below the surface. And there's a really good YouTube video that probably some of you have seen about a Mars bar being buried underneath a Muirburn and the Mars bar being completely unscathed by the fire that happens above ground. There's no evidence to suggest that Muirburn has a negative impact on peat, so I have to admit to being a little bit baffled as to why this measure has been used to govern an activity that has no bearing on it. There's actually evidence to support that Muirburn is beneficial for peat. There's a 10-year project that has been carried out by a university that's gathering that evidence and shows that Muirburn above the ground has a beneficial cause on the peat below ground. So it will reduce the area of peat or vegetation that's managed, and actually conversely it may increase the risk to the peat, because the less vegetation that's been managed above the ground, the more likely that if a wildfire comes through there, that the availability of fuel will be more, the fire will be of a higher intensity, the heat will be higher, and it will last for longer, so it will go down into the peat. It's when it's burned quickly and extinguished quickly that the peat is protected. But a wildfire coming through, and we saw that at Cannock last year, where the peat layer was disastrously impacted and it burned for weeks underground before coming above ground again and hit tree roots. Potential impacts in the negative though, I think it will increase fuel loading across the country. I think if we're not careful we'll see unmanaged landscapes that are ripe for a wildfire to come through and cause catastrophic damage. And one that I've not put on there, but I do want to add, is when we see lessons learned from other parts of the world where prescribed burning, rotational burning, First Nations burning practices were licensed and managed to the point of being unachievable and unworkable. We see catastrophic, landscape changing, life taking wildfires, to the point where managed burns are being brought back in to help manage the fuel load at a much higher cost than it would have been the case had it just been continued, and with a backtrack of people's lives, livelihoods, and the landscape damage for decades, if not centuries.